We're still talking about Gaius Caligula, who later in his reign began doing everything he could to make fun of and humiliate the members of the Senate. One way he had to do this was by removing any role that they had been playing in the choice of public officials, reviving the custom of popular elections, which is interesting because with some members of the Senate, people like Tacitus, beginning to think of the emperors as nothing less than tyrants, that reminds us of the fact that tyrants often had their claim to fame and power by basing it on an appeal to the common people, by downgrading the aristocracy. So taking the pose of a democratic type of leader. And that's something that we'll see in the ideology and propaganda of emperors to come. So reviving popular elections, of course, this is more symbolic than anything else because even now, the only people that are being appointed to any important offices are already members of the imperial in group. There was a more substantial encroachment on the Senate when Gaius started interfering in the senatorial governorships, removing some senators from important provinces and appointing his own representatives. During the next few years, he begins to indulge his own taste for private extravagance. His rule becomes harsher and harsher. He has lots of people killed, including his own backers and supporters, like Macro, the Praetorian prefect, and then, of course, Tiberius Gemellus, the grandson of Tiberius, who could not be kept around much longer. Both of them died. Gaius is reviving delation, that is the practice of betraying suspect individuals. He's reviving treason trials, not only because he's a paranoid autocrat, but because he needs the money. He's been spending a huge amount of the vast fortune that he had his hands on. In the end, some people think that the most regrettable thing about Gaius's reign is the encouragement that he provided for the idea of emperor worship. Now, the idea of an emperor being a god, it had been present, potentially at least from the very beginning, with Augustus taking on attributes of sanctity and calling himself Divus Filius, son of the deified one. But during their lifetime, both Augustus and Tiberius had discouraged any form of real worship. But Gaius turns that around and he ends up giving a huge push towards the institution of emperor cult. Some people think that may be because he's even more influenced than other emperors by his closeness to the ruling families and the customs of the Hellenistic East. Some people think he got the idea from Herod Agrippa, who was a member of the royal dynasty of Judea. Another Hellenistic influence came from the imputation and the possibility that Gaius may have been involved in a sexual relationship with his own sister, Drusilla, which is something that the Hellenistic leaders, at least the Ptolemies in Egypt, had been doing for a while. One of the most famous Ptolemy kings had been married to his sister, who ruled alongside him as queen. In that connection, I have another coin to show you on a slide here. This is a coin issued under Gaius's reign, and on the other side, of course, would be his portrait bust. But here we have three female members of the imperial family pictured. In the middle, his beloved sister Drusilla. On the left, his mother Agrippina, and the other one is Julia. Of course, there were several Julias in the family, so it's not exactly clear who this one is, but that's probably his aunt. What can we conclude from this? Well, clearly women were important in the family of Gaius Caesar, but in particular, I think one of the most critical messages here is that Gaius is driving home securely the reminder that he is a Caesar. He's part of this family network. His mother was, in fact, the granddaughter of Augustus himself, and he's got connections on the other side with the family of none other than Mark Antony, Marcus Antonius. So there's a pretty clear message in there that this is a guy of high class, high nobility, high imperial standing. Message conveyed through his reminder of his relationship to those important imperial women. We can see some of their connections in a few minutes on a chart that I have of the Julio Claudian family tree. But yeah, public adulation, megalomania, wild activity going to all extremes. Other weird actions, including Gaius insisting on performing in public as a singer, as a gladiator. Those were, of course, the rock stars of the day. And if you have the power to get yourself that kind of acclaim and you love that kind of fame and glory, an emperor can certainly do it. Singer, gladiator, and then giving orders that they should erect a big bridge built of boats, kind of a pontoon bridge, all the way across the Bay of Naples so he could dress up like Alexander the Great and ride his chariot across it. He's reliving the glory of one of the most famous heroes of Greek antiquity. What else is going on? Well, people are beginning to notice and are not very comfortable with this. There's unrest at home. The troops in the provinces are showing signs of rebelliousness, which can get very serious. And this means that Gaius had to call on the help of a person named Vespasian. He's a future emperor, by the way, but he's also an experienced and effective general. Vespasian was asked to help put down a revolt, a conspiracy that arose among the troops in Germany. That's in the year 39. And that's also notable because Germany and the army in Germany had been one of the most solid core focuses of military support for Germanicus' family and, of course, for Caligula himself, son of Germanicus. But they had to forcefully put down that threatened rebellion. A campaign of revenge followed at home, during which he banished from Rome his own sisters, and in the wake of it, he lashed out against all levels of society, including philosophers, writers, lawyers, and people he had to assume were basically harmless. But he knew pretty clearly that by now he had gone too far and he had become extremely unpopular, which had its effect when finally in January of the year 41, Gaius Caligula was assassinated. He was assassinated by members of his own imperial bodyguard, the Praetorians. They were reacting not only to a lot of the stuff he had been doing over the past few years, but also to some of the strange actions that he took in Germany after that first rebellion plot had been uncovered, including going himself in person and making strange actions that made it look like he was going to try to reenact Julius Caesar's crossing of the English Channel to invade Britain and conquer it. That plan in the end was abandoned, maybe because the weather was unfavorable, but also because Gaius was not much of a military leader, and he ended up spending his day on the shore gathering seashells and claiming that he had conquered Neptune, the Lord, the god of the seas. So he messed up all kinds of things on the frontiers, including in the east. He dethroned the king of Armenia, which invited the Parthian Empire to interfere there. Very dangerous for Rome's interest in that area. He gave some eastern kingships to some of his own personal friends, including some members of the Herod family. He had a disastrous Jewish policy, which involved wanting to have statues of himself set up in Jewish synagogues, which is, of course, anathema to the Jews. But he's claiming to be the God of everyone, and he wants the Jews to worship him as well, including in their own temple in Jerusalem. Even worse, he gave an order for the temple to be destroyed once Jewish unrest became just too much for him. That was countermanded basically by his friend Herod Agrippa. He changed his mind and ordered it to be carried through. He gave orders that all the local governors who were not following his wild and crazy commands should kill themselves. But once the Judean governor received that order, it was too late, because he had already received news that the unrest had had its effect in Rome. Gaius had been overthrown and died. The year is 41 CE. Gaius Caligula has now gone. His name has gone down as a synonym basically for wild, extravagant, and sexually perverted behavior. Well, after the dullness of the reign of Tiberius, Rome had had something very different. They had been treated to a much more exciting emperor who showed what potential for tyranny and abuse there was in this system of the Principate. Well, after removing him, the people who had done it were at a loss. Eventually, they managed to beat the bushes enough to find a surviving member of the Julio Claudian family, who then would be shoved to the forefront of the scene. Well, actually, by the way, after Gaius was assassinated, there was apparently some serious talk among the senators, at least, of trying to turn their back on this whole thing. Forget about principate and princeps and emperors, reinstitute the republic. Well, that's no surprise that they might have been thinking along those lines, seeing as how the last two emperors had been either unpopular and boring, or extravagant, twisted, and horrendous. But whoever raised this possibility of a republic was not figuring with one of the most important factors in the new Rome, namely the loyalty of the troops. The Praetorian Guard were really the ones in charge of matters now, and they were determined to find themselves a new Caesar. The Caesars were, in fact, the basis of the power and the status of the Praetorians, and they weren't going to just put that away. So we read about this in Suetonius. I expect you've been reading about it. Suetonius tells us that one of the members of the Praetorian Guard was scouring the palace. He saw some feet sticking out from under a curtain. He realized that they were the feet of Claudius, the uncle of the dead emperor. Claudius was terrified. He threw himself at the soldier's feet. He thought it was about to be killed. But meanwhile, that soldier was eagerly hailing him as an emperor. So what do we learn from this little story? First, Claudius had no particular desire to be emperor. Next, he was the first emperor to be installed directly by the Praetorians. And finally, that he started another custom. He was the first emperor to secure the loyalty of the Praetorians by giving them a cash grant. We hear it was 15,000 sesterces per man, which is a pretty hefty sum. Well, up to this point, Claudius's career had been quite slow. He had not even been a member of the Senate until Caligula declared him co-consul as kind of a joke. And Claudius's own mother had expressed some serious doubts about his abilities. No one would have had the preposterous idea of investing him with imperial power or even a much less important position. But he was linked into that same network of family connections that Gaius had been. He was, in fact, the brother of Germanicus, one of the most popular recent members of the family, and therefore he wasn't going to be allowed to just go back into a private life. I haven't gotten as far as I would have liked to get today, and I haven't shown you yet the family tree of the Julio Claudians, but I'm sure you can find a version if you want somewhere. I'll pick up again with this slide and talk a little bit about the reign of this involuntary emperor, and then the closing moments of the Julio-Claudian family that follow. This is fascinating stuff. Please join me for that adventure. I'll see you all soon. Take care, everybody.